Good afternoon from Singapore and good morning to those who have joined us from Europe. So thank you all for joining us for our panel discussion on sustainable finance hosted by the Singapore Global Network and IMD Business School. I'm Jessie from the Singapore Global Network and I will be your host for today's session. To give a quick introduction of SGN, we are part of the Singapore Economic Development Board that engages with the global community of overseas Singaporeans, expats living in Singapore, as well as friends of the city-state. So we are very pleased to have with us today Ms. Lim Pei An, Head of the Green Finance and Asset Management Division from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, Mr. Mikkel Larsen, Group Chief Sustainability Officer at DBS Bank, and Mr. Sasja Beslik, Head of Sustainable Finance and Managing Director of the J.Safra Sarasin Group. Together with Professor Schmedders from IMD Business School, they will be sharing with us insights on sustainable finance and sustainable business transformation in Europe and Southeast Asia. So before diving into the panel discussion, here are a few house rules to note so that we can make this session fruitful for everyone. Please do respect our speakers and other participants while they are speaking and ensure that your microphone remains muted for the duration of the event. We will also be muting your microphone should there be any disturbances. We would also like to hear your questions, so please do submit them via the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen and vote for the question you would like for speakers to answer. Due to overwhelming interest, we will not be able to take everyone's questions today, but we will also try our best to address a few of the top voted ones. Also, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available in the coming weeks. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Kari Schmedders, Professor of Finance at IMD Business School. So before joining IMD in 2020, Carl held faculty positions at the Kellogg School of Management and at the University of Zurich. He also served as the head of the Knowledge Center of the Swiss Finance Institute, a private foundation in Switzerland supporting and advancing research, doctoral training, and executive education in banking and finance. So Carl, please. Carl, I'm sorry that you're on mute. If you could please.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, the typical thing. After 1 year of using Zoom, I still forget to unmute myself. A warm good afternoon to Singapore and the Asian community. Welcome to this event by SGN and IMD. I'm delighted to lead this panel discussion on ESG sustainability. When I nowadays talk about the topic, I call my lectures Making Sense of the Madness. There's so many things going on all over the world, and what is hype, what is real? And that's sort of what we want to explore today. Now, a big role in sustainability and ESG is played by governments, policymakers, and regulators. So I'm delighted to have Bayan on our panel today. As Jessie said, she's the head of Green Finance and Asset Management Division at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Bayan, in your view in Singapore, what are the big ESG topics that keep you and your team busy these days?
Thanks so much. As you said, there's so many developments. I think the media is also finding it difficult, right, to really seize out what is the true developments versus what is white noise. And clearly, the race to net zero never ends, especially as everybody works towards the COP26 outcomes. I'd say plenty actually from a regulator and MAS standpoint, from disclosures to stress testing, even carbon markets, which I'm sure Mikkel will talk about a lot passionately later, and instruments such as blended finance, and thinking hard in terms of how transition and what that really means for more tricky sectors such as gas, steel, aluminium, and other industries along those same lines. But really coming back, I think, to what it means for the MAS. You may have already seen the sustainability report that was launched about a week ago. And essentially, I think it encapsulates, right, all the efforts that we took in undertaking, different roles contribute towards this climate change as well as a sustainable agenda. And prior to the report, we were actually quite active in terms of articulating our role as a regulator and developer, but also because we are as a corporate citizen on our own, and also as an investor. I think through the report, we also kind of see, what we're trying to do on the operation side in terms of scope 1 to scope 3 emissions, and also trying to work towards, setting out the nearest and the fastest possible time frame in order for us to achieve our corporate net zero commitments. And on the investment side, it's equally important because I think that's where we are able to relate closer to the asset management and asset owner industry as well, in terms of leading by example. How do we make sure that our investment portfolio is also climate resilient? There's a lot of noise around the green investment program, which we concluded, but also diving deeper into what we are trying to do in terms of climate risk overlay, in terms of hedging, and then also longer term outlook on some of these tricky sectors as well. And lastly, as I kind of mentioned earlier, our role as a regulator, as a developer, is highlighted through the 5 key trusts in our Green Finance Action Plan around strengthening financial sector resilience, around enhancing climate-related disclosures and data, which is up and coming, and around green solutions, technology as an enabler, and also building knowledge and capabilities. So definitely, I think this will be a rather interesting session where we can dive deeper into some of these topics later.
Thank you, Bayan, for the statement. So we really hear the landscape for private investors, for companies are changing. The regulators are incredibly busy on so many dimensions. They're doing so much work. Now, that means private enterprises such as DBS Bank in Singapore is operating in an environment that's quickly changing. Mikkel, as the Group Chief Sustainability Officer of DBS, that doesn't make your life easy. You're in a game where the rules are constantly changing. What's keeping you up at night? What's keeping you and your team busy these days?
Yeah, I must admit, listening to Bayan, I'm amazed that she doesn't look more stressed. But actually, I think all the good work that MAS is doing, it's actually helping. So it's actually keeping me able to sleep at night, because in a way, without some of this regulation and incentive, you really have the Wild West. And that, if anything, keeps people up at night. The steering, the taxonomies, that's all really, really helpful. Now, what does keep me up at night is, of course, that fundamentally, we got to find the right balance between accepting that we need to accept that companies are not at this point in time either green nor green if we go into the green agenda here. So on one hand, we have to allow companies to transition, but we also have to set the bar high enough that not everything just passes. So I guess finding that right balance is forever a challenge for anybody who has my role. But besides from that, I think more generally what keeps me up at night, I guess, is to make sure that we have the right product mix that helps the customers actually make the transition. So if we don't have that, it's all good and fine to say that you're a bank who wants to do sustainability. But if you don't have a complete set of tools that can actually help them in that transition, you're talking more than you're actually walking. So for me, that's kind of where most of my, at least, thinking time is used right now.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. I must say, I'm a little shocked. I need to fight my words. Here in Europe, I don't hear people at banks speaking so positively about regulators and endorsing the regulation and the work they do. And so now, therefore, I'm curious to hear Sasja, who is the head of sustainable finance and the managing director at J.Safra Sarasin Group here in Europe. What keeps you up? These changing environments, we have them here too in Switzerland, and then Switzerland in the context of the European Union. That also must cause a lot of challenges to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And what is happening in Europe is actually more of, I would say, maturity of a number of things that have been going on for several years. SFDR and taxonomy are a result of a sort of a long process where the industry, together with regulators, is creating a bit better landscape for clients of various kinds, both on the private banking side and the institutional side, on what sustainable investments are, how they are defined, and also what they could be. And what I mean with that is that one of the things which is quite obvious in Europe is that if you look around, and not only in Switzerland, but in many other countries, is the fact there are very few Article 9 products out there, which are the true sort of a sustainable investment products with the clear objectives. And that tells you a bit about the landscape in terms of how much of the hot air is actually present in financial industry from sustainability point of view. What also sort of worries me a bit is the fact that given that you have so few Article 9 products, it's also something that is pointing out that the sustainable investment industry as such is not able to show what exactly clients get when they invest in sustainable investments, when they get these type of products. What is the outcome of these products? Do they create any difference on the ground? And I think this is something that regulators, probably in Singapore and many other countries, are asking themselves. So if we do regulate this, what will be the outcome? Are we sort of trying to steer the outcome towards the right improvements on the ground? I think we should also be aware of the fact there is too much of the focus on the climate change and too much of the focus on the sort of a green side, or let me put it that way, CO2 emission side, and very few focus on social angle of this and consequences related to this, which is worrying from a perspective that you will have a zillion of industries that are in the midst of transformation. It will impact huge amounts of people around the world. So that are the things that are sort of bugging me, I would say, on a daily basis in my work.
Thank you. Let me just jump in there, because what you just said, do products have really an impact? And do they pay for themselves? So do I sacrifice a lot of return if I go into these products, and then do I do any good? Is there an impact? To give you an example, we have several finance programs right now here on campus in IMD. And I taught a session on sustainable finance. The first question came, this is all bogus. This is all, to use your words, hot air. So my questions to you now then, Sasja, do you believe and can you document a real impact? And how would you argue brown is beating green? Do I need to sacrifice returns when I sort of go for these products? Sasja first, please. Mikkel, I see you strongly shaking your head. I love to see that reaction, but let's go first, Sasja, then you. Sasja,
I think it's a very relevant question, but I think it's like with everything else, it depends how you do it. It depends on geography, type of the product. It depends on your capacity, experience, and so on. So there is no one solution fits all. Yeah, it would be madness to believe that all sustainable investment products, or the ones that claim they are, will give you a better performance just for the sake because they are sustainable or branded that way. So it pretty much depends on how they are done. You know, what geography, what kind of access do you have to data? How credible is management team that is behind doing it, and all of these things. So I think that the fact is, and this is the fact, that we need to we need to look at the mirror, and we need to see that the industry has been saying that they have been taking in, PRI has a zillion of money behind it. If you look at the primary markets, the emissions, if we talk about that, are going up. So there is a disconnect between the primary markets and secondary markets, and this needs to be dealt with. And this is what I think authorities, both in Singapore and other countries, are actually trying to bridge with the regulation. And this is a one step at the process towards that. But the biggest problem is that we need to be able, as an industry, to show our clients this is what you get in terms of sustainable outcome when you invest in these products. And there are very few people out there, very few big corporations, asset managers, that are able to show that. And that's a problem for the industry, because sustainability and sustainable investments as a concept has been a process-driven thing. But now it's moving from the process to outcome-driven. And that's completely another ballgame for entire industry.
Wow, these are critical words. and from someone in the industry, from someone as a head of sustainable finance. Now, Mikkel, you had a strong, at least visual reaction. Can you share your view and add to what Sasja said?
Yeah, I'd like to. And I think Sasja said all the right things here. I should start off by saying that on balance, I do think there's value in the ESG investment movement. But I think we, as Sasja also very clearly outlined, we have to keep in mind that what you get for your money. So, for example, there's nothing wrong with financing renewable energy. It's good business, and therefore it gets done at least at this point in time. But if you take a deeper look at these things here, when we talk about the billions of dollars that moved into ESG, or we talked about the 17 trillion or whatever the number is that needs to get put into the SDG solvent, you start to see a different picture. And this is where the difference between impact investment and ESG investment really shows up. Let me give you an example. Out of all those billions of dollars, when you look under the hood, about 1% goes into the real truthful impact investment. And it's not too difficult to understand when you really start to look at it. I used to run a little exercise when I teach classes and speak to people. And I asked them to say, if you had $1 million to invest in the 17 SDGs, where would you put your money for most impact? And almost always the outcome comes out the same. They would put it into primary education, water sanitations, these types of things. And then when you look at where we're failing most on the SDGs, and you realize all that stuff happens in sub-Saharan Africa or someplace in Southeast Asia. But that's not where the money is going. And why is it not going? Because there's a big difference between something being commercially viable and being good for the economy as a whole. And there's really very little financing that goes towards mosquitoes nets or primary sanitation in those type of places. So that does not mean that there's anything wrong with being something labeled as an ESG product. It just means that we have to remember that there's a large step between that and then create true impact on the ground. And that also answers your question, is there a trade-off? We did a little study together with a university, and we looked at, well, where are the different industries that needs money, and are they financeable? And yes, there are certain industries where there doesn't have to be a trade-off at all, but there are many where there still needs to be, and that's okay. That's where we need other types of financing. But I think, as just landing on the point that Sasja says, as long as you have a good labeling of the products, what are you getting, what are you not getting, it's okay. It's a lack of labeling that you get, and therefore there is this risk that everything just gets put into one bucket, and this is where the greenwashing starts.
Wow, yeah. Your last points reminded me of a beautiful quote I read in the Financial Times a few weeks ago. ESG investing is a marketer's dream, because even done poorly, you can sell it well. And that's sort of a frustrating statement. Now, I hear a lot of challenges or outright obstacles from the banks. Now, Bayan, how can you make, I even sense frustration in the progress, in being in this difficult environment. How can you help them along? Both Mikkel and Sasja said they welcome your action. How can you help them to make the distinction between true impact and greenwashing? Help us to make green win.
Yeah, so I would say, really echoing what Mikkel had said, that I think it's extremely challenging from impact space, because it's not really just about saying on the dotted lines that there are certain SDG goals that a firm or asset manager is subscribing to, but ultimately being able to articulate what are the metrics, how do you measure them, and then ultimately then do a quantification from a monetary perspective on the balance sheet. But I would say that actually fundamentally one of the biggest challenge that I think is resulting in all this noise and also perception about whether there's greenwashing or not is really around lack of data as well as a lack of, very good disclosures. Because ultimately, once, there's this proper, robust and comparable disclosures that are put in place, then essentially it's a reinforcing tool where then there is a good market discipline. Even if you are labeling as an eco-label fund or whatnot, the disclosures and stuff will be able to allow investors and even the end users to be able to better understand what are the true dynamics. And I think there are multiple challenges out there with fragmentation in the disclosure space, and that the process of even ESG data acquisition, for example, is rather manual, is cumbersome, and sometimes also prone to errors, and also kind of lack of transparency. So from that angle, actually, there is also already some positive, good progress in the international space, right? Where there is a momentum to work towards a global sustainability reporting standard, which I think is actually in the step in the right direction. You probably have seen that the G7, rectified and said that they, are very in support for mandatory disclosures. But more importantly, IOSCO, which is that body that looks after, reporting standards and whatnot, they are also working towards, a baseline kind of global sustainability reporting standard that essentially builds on the good work that TCFD is doing and overlaying with whatever other standard bodies have in place. So I think this is an area that MAS we are, kind of actively paying attention to and also leading, where we are co-lead in one of that technical task force to see whether that prototype that ISSB under IOSCO is developing is eventually fit for purpose for the industry.
Thank you very much. So many more changes ahead in months and years to come. That's what I learned here. Now, before we continue with the panel discussion, dear audience, we wanted to also hear from you. So we prepared 2 poll questions here in Zoom, and I hope you are willing to participate. Jessie and Alberini, maybe you can now put up the first poll question, where we want to ask you about how would you describe your level of awareness and comfort with the topic of ESG? You heard some of the topics that people at the very forefront are thinking about. In that context, would you say that you feel very good about your level of awareness and comfort, decent, average, or low? We want to give you maybe 30 seconds or a minute to answer the question. So please shoot away. I also see already there are some questions coming in. Thank you very, very much. Our team, we will collect them and hopefully be able to get some to answer. So, and later on, so. So we have, and here we go. So 11%, quite a small piece, said they feel very good about, 37 decent. So that makes almost half think they have a decent or very good understanding. Average comes narrowly out ahead, and 14% of you, of those who participated, said low. As a second question, we wanted to ask, or beyond your understanding, what is your current view on ESG? I hear very different views. Some people say it's mostly a marketing hype, it's a fashion, it's a flavor of the moment, of these couple years, and it will fade. Other people say it's important, but it currently is overhyped, and some people consider it very critical. So Jessie and Albert, Rini, maybe we could have the second poll now. So we see sort of a very mixed 50-50 on comfort level. And now, what's your attitude? What's your view? The poll appeared briefly on my screen and then went away, but maybe that's because here we go again. Thank you very much. How would you describe your current view? Is it mostly a marketing hype? And it's something that the banks use for branding currently. Honestly, I must admit, I have a few friends who think that, in particular those in the United States. And then some people think it's important, but it's completely overhyped. And then some think it will stay with us for years to come. And here we go. The results are only 10 think it's a marketing hype and it will fade away. 27% think it is overhyped, but the vast majority think it will stay here. Now, one thing, of course, that's feeding the hype, or that some people think it is overhyped, is that the issues that all three panelists mentioned earlier, that there's this greenwashing and that there's a lot of talking the talk. Not everyone walks the walk. Not every sustainable product or ESG product really deserves the name. And so that really clearly is a challenge now for the banks to set themselves apart. How are you different? What are your successes? And how you try to set yourself apart, that you're better than the rest. Mikkel, DBS in Singapore, what are your successes and how do you try to really, we all know you're in a very competitive landscape, there's a fight for assets under management. What are your successes and how do you try to separate yourself? In particular, as by Arne said, there isn't enough data yet. We have this alphabet soup of ESG ratings, what some people call it. What do you do to stay above your peers in this messy and competitive environment?
Well, thank you. I'm not even sure. Of course, I'll answer the question, but I think rather than telling you how wonderful DBS is, of course, I do believe that. I think it's important that we start somewhere else and just talk about the fact that these things need to be lifted together. And it needs to be lifted not just by the regulator. It's quite easy for me to sit here and say, oh, the regulators have to do something for me. But reality is that all the boats lift if we get this right, and all the boats sink if we don't get this right. Yeah. So I think, although it's a competitive landscape, I think some of the ways that Singapore have addressed this by actually bringing the banks together, and MAS is very good at this, is the right approach to this, right? You know, it's no good that I win 100% of the market that is zero, because everybody realizes that this has no impact or believes that. So that's my starting point. Now, how do we think we are different, or what is our approach to this? So one thing that I think has been an important cornerstone in our strategy has been that we came out with a transition finance framework. And now this is becoming a little bit more well known, but we were the first one to do it as far as I know. And it's recognizing that nobody in Asia or anywhere in the world is really truly green, unless I'm focusing here on climate change, truly green or truly brown, right? They are on a transition. And therefore the financing mechanism that we offer have to fit into a framework that acknowledges that and take people a ride. So if we cannot support people on that transition, we have failed our clients, right? We don't walk away from them. So our financing is based on finding those companies we seem to have a credible transition path and then financing them through that. And that means that our offerings, which is not uniquely different from anybody else, but it's trying to fit into that framework. So that's one thing we've done. The other thing that we've done, and that's more for our own understanding, is we try to really look at, for every dollar that we lend to certain industries, what is the real impact that we made? Now, the reason why we do this is it gives us consciousness around that there is an impact, both positive and negative externalities of these things. And although it takes time to put these really to work in a company, it shows the effort that we've been trying to go through to try and actually make conscious decisions around what it is that we're financing. And then the third bit that I think is we try to bring a tool set that allows companies to go through a transition that needs to take place sooner rather than later. That means that the tool set involves different types of financings, and including also the latest things now with carbon credits, because we realize that we need to take some of these actions now. So therefore, the tool set probably is a little bit wider for us than it is from some of our competitors.
Okay, thank you, Mikkel. So Mikkel sort of took the high road and looked at the big picture. Sasja, I need to go back to my previous question. On the competitive environment and trying to set yourself apart. Recently, some of our clients here at IMD, private banks, some of your competitors, they come with this question, we don't want to be also an also run. Everyone runs in the same direction, but we are in a competitive environment. And we get challenging questions from our clients. So if we go back for a moment to this competitive environment, how do you try to stand apart? How do you try to convince your clients that your products have impact and deliver return? Please.
I think that goes pretty much to a fact that J.Safra, Sarasin, private bank and asset management have been doing this for 30 years. I mean, this has been a legacy. It is now everybody's integrating sustainability. This has been a cornerstone of the basically asset management approach that JSS has used for many years. It's nothing new for us. The way how we sort of feel, and also we can clearly see that from interest from the clients that we serve, both on private banking side and institutions, is that we are producing providing a number of Article 9 solutions across different asset classes, and we can show our clients exactly what they get. And this is something that I strongly believe that it's going to be a prerequisite to succeed in a commercial sort of a landscape that we are looking at on a global level, especially I think in parts of Asia, which is very much focused on the results and keep KPIs and indicators, and people want to get things measured. I mean, in a number of these Article 9 solutions that we provide, which are different asset classes, not only on equities, but also on fixed income, we can clearly see that it's not only about achieving the sustainability improvements on the primary markets, but it's also providing good returns, investment returns. We should not forget one thing, and this is something that I think people mix up sometimes. Asset management business is all about people, and it's all about making services and servicing people and organizations are people as well, with the solutions that are defined and scoped by people on the other side, and they need to understand what they get. And it is about performance, it is about financial returns, but does not mean that you are not able to provide investment solutions that are also addressing a number of ESG challenges. I mean, one of the things that we did, which I think it's quite interesting, we were talking about scope 1, 2, and 3. We are looking, and we have developed a forward-looking climate engine that also look at scope 4, which is avoided emissions. And this is something that we can do because, I mean, the data availability today is bad, but there are industries where you can actually look at scope 4, which is avoided emissions, and you can see on basis of that where the opportunities are. And as Mikkel said, and I echo that, we want to help companies by our investments to transform and transit themselves. This is not black and white. This is quite a gray area, and you need to be able to navigate in that area. And having, the ESG investments was before about having some kind of an ESG policy and try to get some things into your investment processes. Now we have a data clearing center, we have analysis team, we have a team that looks at the regulation, we have a team that looks at modeling. So there's a lot of things in place today that you need to have in order to be to claim that you're doing sustainable investments. And these solutions and clients that we serve are far more advanced than before. I mean, some of the requirements that we get, for instance, from France or from some other European countries, even Nordic countries, are quite complex to serve. I mean, we have Article 9 products where we have to hit over 20% of the green revenues for every company that we invest in. These are not simple things to do, but it requires you to have infrastructure to be able to do it.
Thank you, Sasja, for this passionate endorsement of products and what you're trying to do. Bayern, you earlier mentioned already that you're working hard in setting accounting standards, in more data coming out of companies, that you are trying to help banks such as DBS and J.Safra Sarasin, when Sasja touched on this, that data is so important to them, and yes, it's still a gray area. Could you perhaps go a little bit deeper, deep dive? What can we expect in the next 1, 2, 3 years to change on the data side? I know you already mentioned it on a sort of higher level. Maybe just give us a little bit of a flavor of a deep dive. What is to expect? How are you going to make the life easier on the measurement side, on the analysis side for the banks, for the asset managers and the wealth managers then selling these products? Please.
Right. So I think I kind of mentioned, conceptually what we are trying to do with our international counterparts essentially is to have, one single unified and standardized disclosure standard, such that at least it reduces the complexity, the reporting burden, and also difficulty in understanding what this data is being reported by companies. And immediately it can be used for purpose. But actually, from a very practical standpoint, we are also trying to use technology to enable some of these outcomes, because ultimately we have seen how, for example, technology such as satellite or IoT devices and whatnot can be used in other forms of application outside from financial sector, right? So why don't we also learn from that and try to, adopt such technologies in the use of data collection, such that, through these IoT devices and whatnot, it can create more agile reporting, more live reporting, as well as maybe cleaner sources of data. Essentially, even from the end user in the supply chain, it can be transmitted directly to the entity that requires such data, and then they can use it for their own purposes as well. And that is why, within MES, we actually launched what we call the Project Greenprint. Essentially, is a consortium of both industry practitioners, some technology players, the government, all trying together to see how we could use technology to mobilize capital, to deepen the impact and whatnot. And there's many different exciting projects that we have in place, including, for example, how do they use technology, right, to increase the access of credit financing to agriculture farmers, especially the smaller entities out there, because there isn't data, but maybe with technology such credit understanding, ESG outcomes can be articulated more clearly. There's also others, for example, like using blockchain and technology and whatnot, essentially to make sure that these tokenized financing solutions can be offered and the data is transparent. Everybody from the investor to the producer of that solution all knows what's happening as well.
Wow, many changes are coming. So fascinating to hear. Just a little view from my side. In Tuesday's class, it was a class of people in CFO offices outside banks. So deputy CFOs, people on a career path towards CFOs. And I asked them, in your company, do you measure greenhouse gas emissions? No. In your unit, do you have any idea how many emissions you have? No. Do you know the difference between scope 1, scope 2, scope 3? Forget even scope 4. No. So I think this is really, and that this was eye-opening for me. I said, aren't you reporting to analysts? Aren't you reporting to the DBSs and J.Safra Sarasins of this world? And so I think this is really needed, that a lot of companies need to do their homework and give the data to experts, yeah, such as all of you, so that you can really analyze what they're doing. Now, at this point, I want to do a little bit of a detour and go back to something Mikkel emphasized in his last statement, namely this E versus S. The just transition, the problem of getting where we are today to a greener economy. And so my sense here in Europe is, as I'm sure many of you in the audience know, we have a lot of these young green politicians who say, oh, let's just go green. They, in my view, fundamentally do not understand the conflict you sometimes have between the E, cutting greenhouse gas emissions, and the social responsibility that banks, particularly in Asia, have towards their communities and the community work they are doing there. Let's start here back in Europe, Sasja. Is this something that European banks truly understand? The issues that you have? For example, if we switch off all coal-powered plants in Asia, what some people are dreaming of, you can't do that in a country such as Indonesia, where 60 or 70% or more out of electricity comes out of coal-powered plant. Is there an awareness here, or at least a growing awareness of the transition problem, the transition risk?
Short answer to that question is no. And the reason why is that the ESG narrative, as we have it today, is dominated by a Western view based on Western prerequisites for transition. So what it means in the principle is that the ESG narrative today does not take into account the transition costs in terms of the both time, energy, and resources, and the social sort of angle of it. Because it's sort of it looks at the world from the point where some of European countries are. So it's much easier to switch energy supply in some of European countries than it is in India or Indonesia and some other places around the world, including South America. So it means also that I think there is a challenge in interpretation of, let's say, what some Asian companies are trying to do or doing, and they get misjudged and they get scored very poorly. Sometimes because of lack of disclosure, sometimes because they are not addressing the right thing according to Western-based investors. And that is because most of these investors are actually not understanding the context where these industries are operating in. And that's a very challenging thing. And I think that will probably change in a couple of years. And if you look at the social sort of angle, which was part of your question, and I think if I go back in the history, so during the industrialization, we had unregulated working time, poor, bad working conditions for people, and so on. And this is something that regulators, politicians were regulating and then creating a new frameworks where this could be challenged. And this is the same thing here. I mean, we will see more and more regulation in this space. And now it's sort of very much in the focus. And if you ask me, are banks focusing on this? I think currently the financial system is in such shock, because this is the first time in history that it has to take externalities into account, that it impacts through lending and investments. And that means that it cannot deal with, it cannot sort of take in more than one big topic at a time. And just to give you an example, so you have still in Europe, the climate risks are not part of the financial accounting. They're not. Banks banks, normal companies, are not in principle requested to include the climate risk in their financial accounting, which will make the balance sheet look completely different, depending on how the price of certain climate risk will look like. And this is something that in 5 years' time will look different. And probably in between now and next 5 years, you will have more and more voices being raised. One, to see how we can help other parts of the world that are not in the same position as we are to transform, and help them and still invest in them, not avoid them as we do today, and try to sort of make them to move where they need to be from sustainability point of view and not exclude huge parts of universes as we do today. I mean, if you look at how it looks today, I mean, the emerging market companies are in many cases disadvantaged in all of the scoring, not because they are bad, but in most of the cases because they don't report, as your CFOs were telling you, and because they don't understand the context. And if they do, and they will, I think this will change very quickly.
Thank you, Sasja. Many things you said are depressing me. On the one hand, on the other hand, Mikkel, there's a huge opportunity here for Asian banks to lead this transition, because you have such a much deeper understanding, and your clients, I would assume, have a much deeper understanding of the challenges, of the problems than some of Sasja's clients. So, huge business opportunity for you.
Yeah, this is partly true. Although I would also say that this realization is probably case by case, especially country by country. Can I start somewhere else though, and just recognizing what Sasja said? I think this is a topic where you really need to think through the implications on lending pretty much, as I said, country by country, and you need to find a balance here. I'll give you 3 examples of where I think Sasja is absolutely right. One is, as you mentioned already, when we read in Europe, for example, the energy transition is much more easy to grasp, but it's bigger than that, right? When we see companies slamming down on palm oil, good way or bad way, but there's a very binary views on these things. Public perception is that it's bad. And the third situation where I see this a lot is the request for emerging countries to protect nature and wildlife, although we know that that hasn't really happened very much in the West. However, and this is where the balance comes in, we also have to accept that the pressure is real. And I'd add to that, so while I think there needs to be an acceptance that not everybody is at the same starting point, we also cannot ignore these types of things. So I think whether we got the balance just right now, I don't think we did. I think we've gone too overboard with climate change risk, and for a couple of reasons. One of them, it is real. 2, there's the data to support this. The problem is that it is so much easier, it's difficult, but it's much easier to calculate carbon emission than it is biodiversity impact or the impact on livelihoods or jobs. So we tend to skew everything towards the things that is easiest to measure, and we drive policies towards these things, right? And in doing things, inevitably, we will therefore get the balance slightly wrong. So my position is that the end goal is clear. We need to be able to measure and account for all externalities. In the drive towards that, we have to find a way to make decisions. Now, we did this with this impact measurement work that I said that we've been working on, but it's not easy. It's not easy. So again, all what this boils down to is, yes, there is opportunity. Yes, DBS is trying to take a more balanced position on this, but we cannot run away from the narrative that is very real, that it all comes within the confines of, we got to get our act together on climate change in the very near term. So there's a lot of perspective in one answer, but I think it's important to address the very near term, and then the longer term, but we all know what the right answer is, which is cement.
Thank you, Mikkel, for your view along this. Now, this must be particularly difficult for a regulator because you're supposed to represent the entire country of Singapore. You can't just only think of the climate, you're also concerned about this transition. So you must have not just the environmental pressure, but of course also the social pressure on a political dimension. And then in the context of the neighboring country and the ASEAN community. That must also be a challenge. How do you sort of try to balance this as a regulator, Bayan?
Yeah, so I think it's precisely right, that actually we should see environmental outcomes and social outcomes to be closely interrelated, intertwined, rather than two distinct things where, you know, people pursue environmental outcomes and then they totally forsake whatever that's happening on the social side. And precisely because of that, recognizing that, you know, our neighboring countries, Singapore included, we are still in the developing phase. Growth is still growing at quite a high steady state. There's many social implications if we immediately switch off financing to the transition sectors and only focus on the dark green sectors, right? And therefore, because of that, I think it's very necessary as a regulator and, you know, as a body to work with the industry to come up with what we call a classification system or taxonomy in essence, to define not just, you know, the dark green or the brown, but really the complexities in the transition sector. For example, even in natural gas, which is a hotly, widely debated topic, even in Europe, right? With Eastern Europe and developed Europe seeing different views. Even in steel, aluminium, or even, you know, using a very simple example, should we even build more highway roads in our neighboring countries? Because the purists may think that, you know, by building more highway roads, essentially encourages more emissions because more cars will travel. But do we need to take such a purist view, or should we support also, for example, economic inclusion and growth as well? And precisely because of that, I think it's important as we work with the industry to develop and flesh out our taxonomy. The strong focus is on transition. There is this what we call a traffic light system, which is the green, yellow, and red, and yellow symbolizes transition. But more importantly, is not just taking into account that social and economic context, but also to be backed by science, because we can't just rely on that. We also need to work towards net zero ultimately. So it's really doing that balancing act such that over time, whatever thresholds that we put in place, there is a methodology to guide us, for example, in phasing out certain activities down the road. Maybe 10 years later, what is a transition activity? Maybe a red activity, who knows? Or maybe the thresholds will become tighter and stringent. But at least in this window of time, we do help to support some of these activities.
Thank you. I have bad news for all of us. We are running out of time, and I got the signal sort of to transition towards the Q&A. We had hoped to do one more round on sort of a future outlook, but if I summarize the last statements, we have already heard what's on the horizon. More data collection, better or clearer standards that then the banks can use in the analysis of data, in the construction of products. We got a lot of questions in the chat. A big thank you and a big sorry, I can't address all of them. We will collect them. We will try to see whether we can get some answers in writing to them. So thank you, and a very sorry that we can't answer all of them. One question was, and perhaps Mikkel, you could address this. Mikkel is the interim CEO of a new carbon exchange that hopefully will go into action later this year. And there's a question is there a level playing field in terms of carbon emission pricing? Or more generally, let me generalize this question. Where is carbon emission pricing going in Singapore, in Southeast Asia? Can you give us a brief outlook there?
Sure. So I don't think there's a price separate for Singapore or Southeast Asia unless you put it into a compliance regime. The way carbon prices work, it takes a bit too long probably to educate myself or this group with this, but in the voluntary space, it's really an international price. And that international price today ranges everywhere from $1 and all the way up to $40. So the reason for the difference is because they do different things. They have many what's so-called co-benefits. The trend is clearly upwards going. So where today the market is relatively thin, about 150 megatons, and it trades, well, maybe I put it at $5 today. The outlook is that the volume is going to grow to something closer to 2.5 gigaton, and it's going to be pricing around $20 to $50. Now, the reason why you could ask the question that was being asked around the Asian price is the way you can try and help the price go up is if you allow it to count towards the carbon tax that you would otherwise be paying. So for example, as an example, let's say that if the carbon tax was 5 Singapore dollars, isn't it here right now, and you can use these offsets instead, at least anybody would want to buy it up to $5 because that's economically rational. So carbon taxes, which we are seeing being implemented more and more, will be a driver from this. But by far the biggest driver at this point in time is the voluntary commitments that companies are making towards net zero or carbon neutrality. And they realize, and I won't go on for too long, that even with the best of technology, they cannot do this in the near term. And so even companies, and those should always be the case, who try to do the very best they can to reduce first and then compensate, will need carbon offsets in the near term at least. And I would argue also in the much longer term, but it gets into a much different type of conversation. It's also around the fact that these are good for so many more things than just carbon sequestering. I'd like to go on for another 5 minutes, but I suspect you'd stop me.
Yes, I'm afraid. I think we just need to make this a regular meeting among the four of us and this fantastic audience because there's so many issues. Bayan, a big topic in the last 5 years or longer was the digital transformation, AI, machine learning. You briefly mentioned that, and now, of course, the question is, again, we are going quite deep here into a deep dive. Can you make this a little more hands-on? How do you want to use AI or machine learning or digital technology in your policies and then generating data for the banks?
Yeah, so I think I kind of alluded earlier as well, really is through the Project Green Queen, where we are working with like-minded partners and bodies to use such sophisticated technology, right? Either blockchain by tokenizing certain assets, such that, it's beyond really making sure that the trade settlement is fast, there's a quick transfer of information, but also the ESG or green credentials of that instruments are readily available on that tokenized exchange, and people are able to decipher the information instantaneously or in a reasonably quick span of time, and also in a proper manner where the data is transparent. Other examples that I kind of cited was, really using like IoT devices and whatnot to measure data in a quick and inclusive manner as well, such that, we are able to get the raw data feed directly from source rather than from the index providers.
Thank you. I believe this will be very important to increase the speed of information from industry to investors, and so hopefully you can make that work. Last question, Sasja. We talked a bit about the transition, but there was clearly a lot of emphasis sort of on the climate finance, ESG, there's a lot of the E. How much are the 17 UN development goals a concern for you, for your products, for your customers? Is it really mostly E, or is this a topic that's relevant too? Thank you.
It's a very interesting question. Let me start by saying one thing. Analysis eats data for breakfast, regardless of what kind of data we talk about. And we can have as much data as we want, but analysis makes a difference. And I think one thing that I want to stress is the fact that the true sustainability gains of this world in the next 20 years are in Asia, Africa, and South America. There are financial gains and there are sustainability gains. Yes. SDGs are developed by governments, and there are 17 goals, and they are really good. Now, there's a lot of transformation of these SDG goals into reporting to clients on a product level, and we do that. This is a regular thing that we do on any of our products. We can report that. However, you should bear in mind that the data available for many of these SDGs, of course, is still not as credible as it should be, and it's used a lot in marketing, which is of course something that is not good. And it's also, you have to bear in mind that the current SDG reporting, it's a very biased toward positive impact on the SDGs. There are no, and I'm saying that again, there are no asset managers in the world today that will report the net SDG impact in their product. Companies in a product, they have a positive impact, but they also have a negative SDG impact on the 17 goals. And this is not reported. And that's why in the reporting we provide to clients, we're very clear that these are the estimates that we do based on the information we have access to. And they take it for what it is, if it's important. I mean, there are many clients that actually think this is important, and they can sort of take that on into their own investment decision-making process or towards their clients. I think this will evolve. I think SDGs are still probably mostly related to, as you mentioned, environmental angle. Just to give you one of the SDGs that is very hard for companies to report how to contribute to peace, to world peace. I mean, on the human rights side, it's very interesting how do you report on that. So there are things that will probably develop over time. They're good as a framework. I'm not always convinced they're good for investment framework as investment thing for various reasons. If it's good for clients to understand, yes, I think to some extent it is. What is most important for me is that in the future we are able to provide our clients with a net SDG impact, which actually depends on how companies report their positive and their negative contribution to the SDGs. Because right now, I think we are very much in a positive space. And I would like to sort of end this by saying that the ESG as a toolbox has a tremendous capacity to contribute to better investments. It's probably the greatest opportunity in the financial sector for many, many years, but it all depends on how it's done. And it all depends where it is done. Just to give you an example, electrifying Swedish traffic vehicles by 2040, it's a very good thing, but helping India to get off the coal is much better.
Yes. Wonderful final statement. Actually, dear audience, you see how these things all go together. We have the additional reporting standards, more data that will help in the analysis of net ESG scores. And of course, as Mikkel then said at the beginning, many companies will not have the technology to get to net zero themselves, so they need the carbon markets. We see data, markets, measurements, products, and where the impact all coming together. And these were wonderful final words to all of you. I'm sorry we went over for a few minutes. A humongous thank you and big applause to our 3 expert panelists. I would love to do this again, hint, hint, Jessie and Alberini. A big thank you, a good afternoon, and I hand over to our host, Jessie.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Beian, Mikkel, and Sasja. So we've now come to the end of our panel discussion. That was a very rigorous discussion. And I believe we do have many questions left to answer post-event. So do look out for our post-event email sometime next week, and we'll try and send a recording to you as well. So we also like to quickly share about an upcoming event of ours on building product from 0 to 1. So this is held the following Tuesday on 29th of June, where we are bringing together 3 established product and venture builders based in Southeast Asia to share their experiences and network with attendees. So please do sign up by scanning the QR code, or you could visit the link that my colleague Alberini has also just sent through the chat. So before we close, we would appreciate it if you could take some time to fill out our survey that can be accessed through the QR code on this slide or through the link that Alberini has also sent through the chat. So this survey takes less than 3 minutes, but will go a really long way in helping us do better for future events. We have also created a field for you to share about what else you'd like to see following this event. And we are going to keep this on till 10:10 a.m. Europe time, 4:10 p.m. Singapore time. On behalf of SGN and IMD, thank you for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon. So stay safe, everyone.